The following sentence is the start to numerous cultural history lessons in the latter quarter of the 20th century. In 1977, Star Wars was released to cinemas. The film was an immediate hit, captivating audiences with its recognizable characters, iconic locations, and incredible special effects. It had an impact worldwide on how people viewed science fiction and even fantasy itself, and is overall considered to be one of the most important films of all time. But one aspect of its legacy which might not be fully obvious to all is its use in merchandising. Before Star Wars, it was very unprecedented for a single film to be given a toy line, as it was thought that films do not have the lasting cultural presence that inspire such items. Lucas insisted on having a toy line based on the film, which eventually landed him a somewhat unbalanced deal with a small Cincinnati company known as Kenner. This deal took Kenner from being a group known for making bubble guns to being one of the most prominent and successful toy companies of the decade. In 1978 alone, Kenner made an overall profit of $100 million, almost 10 times what it cost to actually make the original Star Wars. Theoretically, with profits like that, Kenner could have funded their own Star Wars sequel without any outside help. This gave some other toy companies a bright idea. Step 1. Create a brand of colorful toys. Step 2. Make a film or television show to get children emotionally attached to the characters who are represented in those toys. Step 3. Use the money made off of those toys to continue producing the fiction, thus creating a continuous cycle of public investment. It was through this widespread toy industry scheme that 1980s entertainment entered what has been called a golden era. This period saw the release of such programs as He-Man, the Masters of the Universe, and its spin-off She-Ra, Princess of Power, the Rankin Bass produced Thundercats, Hasbro's My Little Pony, which would also take additional time to advertise other Hasbro properties such as Mr. Potato Head, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, which was somewhat adapted from a comic of the same name, and, of course, Rubik, the Amazing Cube. That was some weird shit. Some companies had the wise idea to cut costs even further by hunting their merchandising in other countries to import for use. This is what brings our story to Japan, and the toy company Takara. Starting in the mid-1970s, Takara had been releasing a G.I. Joe-inspired toy line called Micro Man, which was a group of 3.75-inch robot men who were meant to be 1-to-1 scale. The lore included in the packaging was that they were from a planet known as Micro-Earth, and that they were very tiny aliens attempting to disguise themselves as action figures in Japanese households. This concept of miniature robots disguising themselves as household items eventually spawned off into a 1983 sub-series known as Microchange. Microchange featured miniature robots who could then change into regular commodities, such as a cassette deck, a group of cassettes, a microscope, a series of toy cars intended to resemble penny racers, and an eerily real-looking gun. Once again, the implication of the line was that these were 1-to-1 scale micro-robots who would then come to life once left alone. So just imagine Toy Story, but with a really real-looking gun. Takara also had another toy line which ran parallel to the Micro series known as Diaclone. Starting in 1982, the line became best known for producing robots who could transform into real-life 20th century vehicles. Notable releases include the Battle Convoy, who could be used to carry other Diaclone figures and would transform into a semi-truck, a group of construction changers who could additionally combine into one big robot, and the Dinosaur Robos, which were a group of robots who could also turn into robot dinosaurs, for disguise purposes. In 1983, Hasbro representatives discovered Diaclone and Microchange at a toy fair, and quickly sought out a deal to combine them into one line for release in America. That toy line was, of course, the Transformers. All of the robots were then sorted into two teams, one good and one evil. Most of the toys that turned into automobiles were deemed the Autobots, and most of the other figures were named the Decepticons, after their nature to be deceptive. The heads of the Diaclone police car robot and the Microchange cassette man both served as the inspiration for two stylized logos. These would be placed on odd places on the Japanese toys to denote which group the robots belonged to. The plan from here was brilliant. The two form figurines already clearly had a much greater potential during during playtime than any other regular toys at the time. Why buy an action figure that looks like a man and a toy that looks like a truck when you could have both in one? And the nature of turning the toys from one mode to the other inspired a significant amount of creativity in children. All Hasbro really needed to push the brand was a catalyst to get their young audience emotionally invested in each toy.
Autobots wage their battle to destroy the evil forces of the Decepticons.
Here is a brief description of the lore of the 1984 Transformers series, as shown in the opening episodes. Far away in the depths of space sits a planet known as Cybertron, which has been plagued by a war between good and evil, the Autobots and the Decepticons. This is Wheeljack. He transforms into a hover car. This is Bumblebee. He transforms into a flying saucer. This is Soundwave. He transforms into a lamppost. And this is Laserbeak. He transforms into a cassette tape. A giant alien cassette tape. Cybertron is a very dead planet with limited resources, causing the Autobots to flee in search of new sources of energy. The leader of the Decepticons, known as Megatron, orders one of his troops to stay behind while the rest follow the Autobots and board their ship. A battle transpires which causes the Autobot ship to crash into a dormant volcano on a desolate and lifeless planet. Beast Wars happens here. 4 million years later, in the 1980s, that volcano erupts, causing a drone in the ship to awaken and begin scouring the planet for compatible disguises for all of the Transformers on board. While the Transformers have slept, a race known as humanity has risen to power, and the Autobots swear to protect them. The Decepticons try and do evil stuff, the Autobots stop them, the screen fades, that's the show. So because Transformers was an adaptation of two unrelated toy lines being combined, there are a few eccentric quirks that rise to the surface very quickly. The first is that there is a great range of artistic styles that seem to come into play during the show. The Autobots based on Diaclone figures that were intended to look like cars, well, they look like cars. Meanwhile, the Autobots based on micro-change figures, which were intended to look like penny racers, are extremely deformed and out of place. This is really a smaller side effect of the bigger issue, that the micro-change toys were meant to be one-to-one scale robots who turned into real household items, and the Diaclone figures were meant to be something like 20 feet tall. The creative team in charge of the show looked at this and responded, fuck it, the robots changed size. It's ridiculous, and I love it. This is logically why Megatron can turn into a gun small enough for other Transformers to hold, why Devastator seems to always grow to an incredible scale larger than he really should, and probably what always happens to Prime's trailer. It just shrinks a lot. Now, there are actually a few other Transformers toys and characters whose origins come from outside of what we've discussed so far. First of all, the character of Shockwave was licensed from a Korean company known as Toyco. The character is the only one who is left behind on Cybertron, presumably because his alternate mode so clearly looks alien. At the same time that Shockwave was being sold as a Transformer, the exact same mold was also being sold at Radio Shack. But the ultimate brand confusion would come about with the character of Jetfire, or Skyfire. It's one of the two. Jetfire was a repackaged toy of the Valkyrie from the Super Dimension Fortress Macross, which was also being adapted into the first third of Robotech around the same time that the Transformers was airing. Most likely because of the intention to eventually air the Transformers in Japan. The character design of Jetfire was greatly changed when first introduced to the show, to pretty much barely resemble the toy at all, and his name was changed to Skyfire for reasons that are not fully understood. The overall intention of the Transformers was simply to introduce characters and storylines which could be interesting to children. Those children would then want to integrate elements of those stories into their playtime, leading them to want the toys. If you have an Optimus Prime, you need a Megatron so they can battle it out. If you have a Megatron, then you probably have bad parents, but if you somehow convince them to buy you a Megatron, you're gonna want a Starscream because they bicker a lot. If you have a Starscream, you're gonna want a Jetfire because they were buddies on Cybertron, and Skyfire's choice to become an Autobot leaves that connection shadowed, and I just think there's some Greek-level tragedy depth left unexplored between Starscream and Sky. In short, the entire point of Transformers was that each episode would show you a toy that you could buy, and would then try and convince you that that toy was extremely important to telling stories in that universe. This means that there's a loose continuity throughout the show, but it was also extremely easy for the writers to trip up and make huge inconsistencies by accident. For instance, early on in the series, it's directly stated that the Constructicons were built on Earth, and that they never existed on Cybertron. But in a later episode, the writers decided to give him a Cybertron origin, saying that they were peace-loving Cybertronians who were brainwashed by Megatron. And even later, in an episode that once again gives the Transformers a new origin story, we see Megatron being built by the Constructicons. Pretty much any episode that explores the origins of characters before the show has to be enjoyed on a standalone basis, because there's almost no consistency present between one to the next. I'm not complaining, by the way, continuity errors are hilarious and I would not fix these. Around the creation of the Transformers movie, most of the original toys were starting to be phased out. The new figures were being created from scratch with the intention of matching up with the animation, instead of the other way around. Basically, most of the characters that we've discussed up to this point were now defunct, and no longer had a reason to be advertised in the show. Given that Transformers was a television show meant for very young children, it was decided that the most logical way to deal with this issue was to murder all of the characters on screen with visceral detail. Transformers the movie is set in the distant future of the year 2005, and the opening act revolves around the original Autobots, joined by a new generation of toys you can buy, fighting a final battle against the Decepticons that ends with the death of both Megatron and Optimus Prime. The choice to randomly murder a bunch of Saturday morning children's icons is really mystifying and bizarre. In general, I think it's mainly just dreamlike to go from an episode of the original show, which was very hokey and written in an extremely rushed and campy way, to this epic animated masterpiece that carries its story with such weight and dignity. Almost every piece of Transformers media that exists today constantly is stopping to acknowledge that the franchise is about war, and that tone is almost completely invented during the 1986 film. The show feels so much light and without consequences. There are literal episodes where characters are ripped limb from limb and then are put back together. And to go from that to a story where Optimus Prime gets shot and dies on an operating table, it's still controversial to this day. The entire movie was notorious for being traumatic for many of the children who saw it, and in that aspect, it's hard to grasp how Hasbro wouldn't have seen that coming. They took these toys, they went out of their way to get a generation of children to see these toys as real people that they were emotionally attached to, and then they made a movie where these lovable characters are killed in bulk in a wave of robot gang violence. The film, if it wasn't clear, was aimed at a slightly older crowd, and in that aspect it was a huge success. From what I've read, the film was a big hit in the punk scene, and it's legitimately one of the most approachable pieces of Transformers media. I would go as far as to say that it's probably one of my favorite animated films. I really enjoy it that much. Many people tend to treat Transformers the movie like it's the end of that era of the franchise, but in actuality, the show continued to run past this point with the new setting and continuity. Seasons 3 and, if you could call it 4, are bizarre. The show maintains the canon introduced by the film and seriously sets out to expand upon it, but it does so with the same tone of the original show and often the same budget. Furthermore, the hovering hand of the marketing behind it was still felt in very odd ways. You see, in Transformers the movie, we meet a character named Hot Rod, who at the start is rather immature and headstrong, but ends up going through a journey in the film before the matrix of leadership opens for him. This causes him to gain a more mature design, which transforms into a truck, signifying that he is now the leader of the Autobots. At this moment forward, he becomes Rodimus Prime. This is a unique way of relaying that Hot Rod has grown as a person. The problem was that throughout the production of the final 2 seasons of the show, the toys for both Hot Rod and Rodimus Prime were in circulation, meaning that the show would suddenly find excuses for Rodimus to lose the matrix of leadership, which would somehow turn him back into an immature teenager. So it's not a metaphor for growth. It's literally an on-off switch between 2 different characters. The final run of Transformer episodes is infamous for having many rushed stories with weak animation, but it also comes with many fan favorites, such as Chaos and Ghost in the Machine. Many of these episodes attempted to carry themselves with a greater weight and importance. Sometimes that worked, and sometimes it didn't. The next to final arc in the show is called The Resurrection of Optimus Prime, and saw the iconic leader coming back from the dead to help save both the Autobots and the Decepticons from a virus threatening to destroy both. In the end, the original Transformers lasted a total of 98 episodes. It spawned numerous comics, games, reboots, toys, films, and other adaptations. In general, like many of the cartoons that came from this era, these creators sought out with the task of getting a generation hooked on a toy line. But they did this through a series of fascinating stories that legitimately created memorable and engaging characters, many of whom have gone on to become revered pop culture icons. I guess, in the end, the Transformers really were a greater quantity than was introduced to the cornea. This episode has been brought to you by today's sponsor, Squarespace.com. Squarespace is the complete website development tool package, giving you everything you need to make the perfect site without any outside resources. Whether you want to talk about a personal hobby, or you want to start a blog, or you really want to do anything on the internet, Squarespace is the place to start. It's extremely user-friendly and allocates a wide section of templates, giving you a spacious assemblage of paths to explore. Over the past 4 months, me and my audience have slowly been working to expand the Squarespace-powered QuintonReviews.com. This time, I decided to give it the ultimate upgrade. Every single page on the site is now dedicated entirely to the How to Open a Tough Jar video. Use my link, squarespace.com/Quinton, to get started on your free trial today. Once again, that's squarespace.com/QuinTon. And with that, thank you for watching. That's been all you need.